it goes right back to the heart of what's generally referred to as South African exceptionalism, right? In which is in some ways the ways it defines the ways in which South Africa sees itself differently from the rest of the African continent. Or at least, yeah, I guess it seems to have had a very different decolonization process. Now, for most people, I think we'll remember the more recent movements like Rhodes Must Fall, which only happened in 2016, and seem to revive the decolonial discourse. And for many people, they were thinking, well, African countries have been here before, right? So much of this was what was happening in the 50s and 60s, in the rise of Pan-Africanism. These are things that were these are ideas that were being advocated for back in the 50s and 60s for the rest of the African continent. Now, South Africa, of course, is very odd because in some ways we had a very early formal decolonization. So we received our independence in 1910, but of course we were still part of the British what's the word?
Empire.
Yes. So and I guess we then obviously experienced what would be seen as a kind of extension of colonization, which was apartheid. Now, apartheid, I think, is probably the thing that would distinguish us in terms of the impact it's had, but also the way that it's heightened racial hostilities. So the apartheid regime, which began from 1948 and ended in 1994, had really long-lasting effects in terms of how South African society operates today. So, I mean, obviously the most visible one is spatial segregation. So the usage and separation, or at least the usage of separate amenities, but also this racial categorization that it's created in South Africa, which is quite unusual as well. So, I mean, with us, when you say white, when you say black, when you say, well, at least when you say African, when you say colored, and when you say Indian, all of those things are, the different kinds of categories that South African government created. And what they actually meant was the limits of the kinds of citizenship rights one could claim. So, and it sort of staggered them. And of course, the category colored, which is generally very historically complex, or at least people were seen as racially mixed, were defined as colored, but that category was used as a buffer between black and white. So when you were talking about your neighbor, initially when you said, oh, there's my neighbor, I have a neighbor from South Africa and he's got interesting things. For some reason in my mind, I just imagined that this was possibly a Black person. I'm not sure why, that thought popped in my mind. And for some reason, the entire thing changed when you said, oh, but he's white. And I'm not sure if if there was like, you intentionally, sort of.
I think I did intentionally, yeah.
Yeah. And so, of course, it sort of changes the way that we begin to think about levels of privilege in South Africa, the kinds of opportunities that were afforded to some and not others, the inclinations to Europe, I think, for white South Africans. And I think one can see it even in the way that, South African spaces or the built environment is fashioned. So, when you look at the buildings here, the institutions, many of them, of course, were built to recreate a sense of being in Europe or to recreate a sense of being in the UK, for example. In some places, of course, there's a very Dutch feel because we were colonized by both the Dutch and the British. So there are places that feel very Dutch, places that feel very British, you know, and then of course the complexity of the relationship between, in terms of the Afrikaner identity with the French Huguenots. So there's some places that feel like they're kind of mimicking being in Paris, right? So there's a kind of strange sense of place, you know, and belonging that I think defines and probably makes South Africa a very difficult place to be in, you know, for different races, as it were. And I think today, you know, if we are to actually address any of those problems, we're stuck with having to work with those categories, because then we have to address equity and not necessarily equality. So yes, so sorry, it's mouthful, but yes.
No,
yes,
but it's incredibly multi-layered.
Yeah. So it really differs. I mean, because if you think about the even the different types of areas. So I mean, the apartheid government, you know, created this geography where you have Black townships.
Can you explain the government? Can you explain this period? Just because I think a lot of people just wouldn't understand.
Yeah. Okay. So when I say the apartheid government, it's mostly based on. So I guess, you know, a lot of people talk about the tensions in South Africa in the creation of the category of whiteness being based on this. Again, I'm sorry to not be articulating this so well, but to be based on the tension between Afrikaner nationalism and British imperialism. And all of that, you know, obviously was based on land, but also the resources in South Africa. Now, of course, we know that much of what's referred to the mineral industrial complex in South Africa is based on the minerals, the wealth of South Africa, you know, gold, the gold mines, diamonds, coal, and it goes on, platinum. Which created which was sort of based on a migrant labor system, but that migrant labor system is something that was already based on legislation that dispossessed Africans of land. So in 1913, there was a Land Act that was passed, and that Land Act made a provision for whites to own 80 to 90% of the land and left whatever was remaining to Africans. And so it kind of created different nations, if one can think of it that way. So white South Africa was mostly much of the more fertile agriculturally, but also more industrially prosperous areas that became the industrial areas. And the Black people were pushed to what was then called the Bantustans. Now, Bantustans just means homelands. And so they tried to kind of create these homelands that were based on social linguistic identities. You know, so Zulu homeland, Xhosa, you know, in one place. But it really it dispossessed people of the land they already owned. People who had been working as sharecroppers, who had been farming on land, were suddenly placed in rural areas, far from the industrial areas. But what that meant is that, of course, to make the economy prosperous, they still needed the labor, right?
Yeah.
So it necessitated, and also to extort that labor, it meant that they had to enforce hard taxes so that people have to leave the agricultural or, you know, more rural places to go and work in the mines. And so it had a very sort of distinct migrant labor system.
But also probably the disproportion in population. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, we, you know, strangely enough, generally when people talk about the oppressed, they talk about the oppressed minorities. we are an oppressed majority, right? So you have this sort of strange interplay where you have a majority that was oppressed, in terms of the legislation that was enforced, but
what was that majority? What was that division roughly in terms of the whites and the blacks in South Africa, so people can understand the scale of oppression of majority by a minority?
Yeah, I don't have the exact stats just on top of my head. Like I would love to give you the exact numbers, but I think today we have a bigger white population than we did, and I think it's
exactly.
I might be wrong. I stand to be corrected. It might be something like 40%, but it was much less.
Less, yes.
Yeah.
Probably in the region of 10%, if not less.
Yeah. So you can imagine the disproportion, that created. And so for a lot of the laborers that had to travel to Johannesburg for work, they had to travel through what was called a dom bus, or what is seen as a dump pass, or dom bus just refers to dump pass. So it's basically just like creating, really separate states.
So there must have been quite a specific type of oppression when you need to oppress majority. You can't oppress majority with force. I mean, because it is majority, right? You kind of have to find subtle psychological ways of oppression. Is that right to assume?
Yes, you do. But I guess the other part of the power that might not, be so explicit is having the power to legislate.
Yeah.
So once you've set laws that restrict people from buying land or owning land, from attending particular schools, from then and if they do, you would have the power to arrest them, right? so I think that is I mean, and so I think what the question you're asking is really important, because it really highlights the different levels and different forms of violence. And so, I mean, of course, there's the direct violence that is historical and has come out of, actual battles and wars, between races, but also even between the Afrikaners and the British, but also between the indigenous people and the British and so on. So they are historical wars, but there's also, of course, the legislative power, I think, that then is used to oppress people. So I think, or at least one can call it judicial power, that's used to oppress, and you can oppress masses. And then, of course, second is ideology, which I think also comes from the rule and divide strategies that have been used for a very long time. So even when we know, even though there's, I'm sort of being very simplistic here, but even though there's kind of a clear sense, I think, even during apartheid, for example, clear sense that there's an Afrikaner government, it's nationalist, Protestant. There were still skirmishes created between the Xhosas and the Zulus, and really, and I think it really were just strategies that we used to divide people. So I think, it's layered. And then there's epistemic violence as well, so the kind of education that was afforded to Black people was not meant to make them think intellectually, to think beyond, to think of themselves as citizens who should participate. So the kind of education that they received, especially during the apartheid government, was the kind of education that was dumbed down, but also it meant, it was created so that people could just about learn to be servants, learn to be miners and domestic workers, and that's it. And so what you do by that is you kill an entire generation of people who could have been, you know, really historically important and intellectually, you know, generative.
Contributing to
yeah,
society.
yeah. But of course, that didn't stop many people from working underground. Of course, South Africa depended on other African countries for their political struggle. So with the armed struggle of the African National Congress, for example, people were sent across the border to Mozambique, to Angola, to many places to continue the struggle on that side. You know, to people were bringing in books that were banned. So people were able to kind of learn and understand and get a political education through underground work. You know, and I think that, you know, made the struggle against apartheid, or at least strengthened the struggle against apartheid. Yeah, and it depended on that solidarity.
Mm-hmm. But then the kind of key element of what South Africa is today is presumably the way it handled that transition, right? So how is that different to what we've seen in other African countries? How's that transition of 1994 different to other processes that happened in other parts of Africa, and how did that make South Africa what it is today?
Yeah, I guess it's the, so I mean, our transition is generally defined by the TRC, right? So most of the time we think about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as the one process that made it possible for us to not end up in a civil war, you know, after 1994. But of course, you know, a lot of people today think back to the TRC and they think about the kinds of compromises that were made in terms of really just not shaking off some of the imbalances that were created by the apartheid regime, but also, of course, historical colonization. So I think in some ways one can say it's different because it sort of seemed to have this very belated moment with, you know, Mandela becoming this icon of peace, but peace that actually still came at the expense of you know, Africans who still for a very long time had to live under very similar conditions in the same segregated spaces, had to still struggle with continued you know, cultures of racism, you know, and you know, conscious biases as well, but very structural economic measures of sustaining very similar conditions to apartheid. And what the TRC seemed to do was that it kind of glossed over this within this rhetoric of you need to forgive and forget, right? So forgive the wrongs of apartheid and forget, because it's the only way we can all heal and move forward. And of course, it didn't work because one can see all of the post-apartheid protests are based on, you know, on fighting very similar, fighting the very conditions of apartheid, which are lingering even, you know, after apartheid, even post 1994. So in some ways, I guess it differs because when one thinks about the rest of the African continent, that transition was defined through, you know, festivals and conferences that were Pan-African, were about African advancement, very anti-colonial in nature, you know, so when one thinks about, you know, yeah, you think about the kinds of politics and solidarity that was happening around the 50s and 60s, it sort of is very different, because I think with South Africa's transition, there's a kind of, you know, this sort of internal process of trying to heal, you know, very deep.
Was there an element of acknowledging the positives of the colonization within that acceptance of multiculturalism and as you say, sustaining to a degree the kind of the status quo?
So I would have to ask you the question back. So what would you consider to be the positives?
Well, that's
colonization everywhere.
No, exactly. So I wouldn't necessarily myself. I mean, you know, I don't think it's a question for me because I haven't been colonized, and so I, as a majority, am making a decision not to persecute and not to and to kind of accept the multiculturalism as a way forward. So I'm just wondering whether within that discourse there is also a certain kind of seeing something that perhaps isn't positive as positive.
Yeah.
And not that I see it as positive, but whether the perception, and that is a perception of somebody who has been oppressed, is that element of that oppression is kind of, oh, this is good.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah. Okay. So, you know, it's funny. It's funny you should ask that, because I think there was a time when people used to, you know, I don't know, it's something that we used to hear, like, you know, your aunts and uncles would say. So maybe you'd have a family gathering, you'll hear them complaining about, oh, post-apartheid, it's so terrible.
Right. Okay.
You know, things are so difficult now. You know, back in the day, we used to have this and this, you know, or oh, it was so better under apartheid because you had, you know, there were, you know, television stations that focused on specific languages and so on. You know, but it's very typical to have heard people say, oh, but you know, under apartheid, this and this used to happen, which is something that's been criticized because it is problematic, right? There's no oppressive system, I think, that can have positives. And even if we may think of them as positives, I think it sort of conceals the fact that there would have been so many potentialities without colonization. So I think, yeah, for me, I don't think there's anything positive about colonization. But yeah, so there's that. And then of course, there was, I think a year or two ago, there's the Western, there's a woman who was at the time the premier of the Western Cape, Helen Zille. And she made a comment on Twitter where she said, and actually it was sort of in direct response to the decolonial movement in South Africa, the most recent decolonial movement in South Africa. And she said in her comment that, oh, but you should be grateful, because if we didn't have colonization, you wouldn't have all of this infrastructure, the roads, the railways, and you know, the pipes and all of this, you know, so your water systems and all of this. So so you should be grateful in some ways, because, you know, she kind of painted those as positives. But in some ways it's really problematic, because it's the kind of infrastructure that was actually built on the bodies and on the backs of the people who were colonized. It's not something, it's not something that just came. The people who labored There are people who lost their lives. Our campus, for example, is built on the graves of slaves. It's land that was taken, it's histories that were erased. And so we might have the infrastructure, but it actually is an infrastructure that performs a kind of violence even on your sense of belonging in place and identifying with it. A lot of people, a lot of Black people will attest to the sense of feeling alienated in their own country, especially in places that have the infrastructure that is very reminiscent of colonialism. But what it's also done is that it has actually placed us in a position of ecological injustice. So the so-called progress has actually done us no favor in terms of our consciousness to our environment, to ecological justice. And what it does really, it just reinforces environmental racism. So yeah, I mean, I don't think there are any positives. I've heard that. So like the comment that I heard when someone saying, oh, during apartheid, we get this. So during apartheid, they created television stations that were catered for Black people. And they produced television shows that were, based on sort of pure languages, Zulu, Sotho, and so on. Whereas today, of course, you get this kind of mix, because people are moving across a bit more easily. There's no policed mobility as there used to be. There's, so it's this kind of mix between English and indigenous languages that's kind of developing. So a lot of the popular culture and literary material is reflecting that sort of cosmopolitan sense of being South African. And so, but even then, I think there were kinds of limitations that were imposed, but also it tended, what it did by doing that is that it sort of placed little borders between people, so these are the things for Zulu people,
yeah.
and these are the things for, so I don't think, for me, I
didn't. Just to clarify, I didn't mean whether there are positive things. I meant whether there were things that were perceived as, and which is actually an important question, as you've just kind of explained, because it's an important question of perception, of how do you move forward as a society and a community if you still perceive elements of that oppression as positives, right?
Yeah, sure. I think so. But also, I think what it does actually is to kind of, I think it's an important question in the sense that we often think around colonization and we think about those who were colonized. Whereas colonization, in fact, imperialism, because it's global, it impacts on those who were colonized and those who were not in various ways. And those who represent the colonizer. So, so you might have not necessarily been the descendant of a colonizer, but by appearance in some places, you might be perceived as a colonizer, right?
Yeah.
So it impacts actually on everyone. And I think the responsibility, of course, then, to undo that is one that is a burden for everyone. But yeah, I mean, I think there has been the perception that amongst white South Africans, that the bureaucratic systems of the past were much more efficient, and that so some would say even that even after apartheid, the land restitution claims for people who were now able to purchase agricultural land, the assumption was that during apartheid, the white farmers knew how to work the land, whereas after apartheid, the Black farmers who were given land are leaving it to waste because they don't have the know-how. So there are all those perceptions are there, and then of course, even in terms of municipalities, people would say, it's that where are the older engineers or engineers from the apartheid system who really understood how to keep efficient municipalities going, whereas now what you have are constant municipal shortcomings, yeah, so I mean, there are perceptions, those perceptions are there, but I think it's important to distinguish what those perceptions can be generalized as in terms of the Black citizen, the white citizenry, and in terms of the Black citizenry. You know, who might say, you know, things have gotten worse, but they weren't any better under apartheid. You know, where you were constantly policed. You know.
But perhaps it's not a question of better and worse. It's a question of well, oppression and allowing something to unfold in its kind of well, natural way. Or I do wonder, how did that impact the culture and the cultural production? And obviously you work within the arts, which we haven't even mentioned so far. But,
yeah.
But you know, how does this reflect on creative production? You know, it's still, presumably it's still a great subject of many people's work, is that kind of, that struggle is kind of embodied in a lot of the art that's being made. But perhaps the next phase would be that art is liberated of it, and that there is a kind of production of creativity and art that is a lot more authentically not tied to the colonial condition.
Yeah. So it's quite complicated because it's kind of created different streams of creative production, where, you know, for artists who were able to access the white institutions and you know, studied in white institutions, were able to be supported through white institutions as well. Those are the artists that have flourished in the art market. And then you have a few that were, you know, from more rural backgrounds or seen as self-taught, that have kind of also, you know, have been part of that market. But I think what the other stream that's kind of overlooked are the creative production, is the creative production of people who, yeah, I guess what is generally referred to as craft, like, which is something I don't always touch, but much of that so-called craft is also what makes you know, a few artists, or at least positioned a few artists in South Africa as so-called transitional artists. You know, so we're kind of like between being a raw artist and being like contemporary and part of the art market. But I guess there's that. But you know, the thing is, prior to 1994, there were different types of, or at least, yeah, I think, you know, if we go way back, a lot of the artists had to be educated, or at least early pioneering modern artists had to be educated through missionaries. Some of them left South Africa to go and live elsewhere. So if you think about, you know, people like Gerard, Sekoto, and Ernest Mangoba, who ended up abroad. But a lot of them had to work through missionaries, and of course, missionaries were kind of trying to teach them art on the basis of the modernism that was happening in Europe. And I think as the years went by, there were certain sort of, and again, I'm being very general around this. So which means, you know, this is much more sort of more accurate and articulate way to place it. But as the years went, and particularly during apartheid, there were categories like township art that were created. So the kind of expectation of what African artists should be producing in order to be authentic. And this is something I think that didn't just affect South Africa. I think in many other places as well. You know, if you think about, for example, in Nigeria, for example, the work of Kenneth Murray, you know, at least the impact of Kenneth Murray even other people like in the Congo, for example, Pierre Lodes, who were determined that in order for an African artist to distinguish themselves as African artists, they have to kind of work on these topics and themes around, folk themes and, sort of primitivist aesthetics that were abound even in Europe, in European modernism. And
because they will be recognized by that.
Yeah, because otherwise
West,
they seem to be mimicking, right? Yes, yeah, which is very limiting. I think for some artists, they kind of saw it as like creating this kind of exotic garden for African artists.
Yeah.
And in South Africa, the township, what was called the township or township art, was mostly the expectation that Black artists should be making work about the experiences, and so of course that work was representing the experience of living in a township, and so obviously the poverty, the squalor, the police violence that was very much present, and of course artists who deviated from that almost sort of fell off the mainstream, or at least let me not call it a mainstream, or at least have become more invisible than the ones who did. And so there were separate, and I guess it created a kind of patron system where wherever there were those artists, there was some kind of white patron who's able to enable them space to exhibit or fashion himself as someone who trains them, so those kinds of imbalances, I think, have been long lasting. Now, of course, after apartheid, a lot of artists were sort of focused on questions of identity, but you'll notice that a majority of those contemporary artists are also artists who were coming out of universities mostly. So even post 1994 really didn't address the imbalances. But also, I think what made it worse was the fact that the post 1994 government didn't support the arts in the way that it should have, and so things that existed like community arts projects, spaces that enabled people to learn, but also to learn politics while they were making art, to be in communal spaces of making art, were suddenly, under, or at least, underfunded, but had to end. And so the post-apartheid era is characterized by these very powerful commercial galleries that have enabled the visibility of South African artists in their stables within the global art market, right? So there's a kind of sort of almost white run commercial art space that has constructed the way that we think about South African contemporary art. And a lot of the themes of, sort of very much around the Black body and so on. So, and one, wonders in terms of like the kind of spaces of consumption and, what that means to kind of be replaying our trauma, reperforming our trauma all the time for consumption, right? So, but I'm digressing.
But I think this is such a fascinating territory because, what is the institutional framework that exists in South Africa at the moment that will allow a production of something that is far more authentic, or that is, or that responds to these questions? In a sense, like, I don't know if you can ask for authenticity when you really almost have to have a conversation first.
Yeah. So I mean, I think authenticity is loaded, and I think it's a speculative term, it's idealist in many ways, you know, and I guess it's loaded because of the kind of history that it comes from. I mean, if you think about in the 60s, you know, Seda Senghor is talking about African aesthetics and African authenticity in a very particular way. Mobutu Sese Seko was talking about African authenticity in a very particular way, right? And these sort of indigenization programs were very particular. So the term authenticity in some ways is very labored. And then of course there's the expectation for authenticity to be something akin to being primitive. So I think there's that historical baggage that it carries. And then of course there's the kind of impossibility of what it means in terms of the actual aesthetics of the kind of work that we mean. But I think the question that you're asking, you know, in terms of institutions, it's very, I mean, I think in South Africa, it's been very rare to see commercial galleries support the kind of work that is not necessarily, you know, embroiled in the politics of the commercial art world. And so the spaces where we've seen that happen are usually, you know, projects by maybe, let's say, for example, academics like Jay Pather, whom I've had the, you know, privilege to work with. So Jay Pather, of course, has kind of curated these collaborative, interdisciplinary, you know, interventions that happen in public spaces and question the kinds of racial and class, you know, limitations and of mobility within public spaces. And then, you know, for some, I think it's where artists themselves come together against institutions to form artist collectives. So it's very rare to see it happen within institutional spaces. So, I mean, if we think about, for example, the work, some of the collectives that I've written about, like Dokolo Stencils and X Collective, you know, who have deliberately worked against the institution, have deliberately, you know, sort of made work that is sort of anti-commodity, you know, anti-aesthetic. You know, they work through stencils, they're anonymous, so they don't have the prestige of like, this is the artist. They and their work is can be duplicated, right? So it can be democratized in many ways. Anybody can download a stencil and put it up in the city. And it's stencils that actually have to do with like the invisible apartheid behaviors and invisible apartheid spatial legacies. You know, so I mean, I guess it's collectives like that. It's when artists themselves organize where they create alternative spaces for production, and where that production would have very little to do with commodity, and then also, you know, spaces that are enabled by academics and scholars like Jay Pather, who then create the space, or will raise the funds to create the space to enable works that aren't necessarily, that will, you know, the artist will still be able to benefit, but they don't necessarily have to be forced to make work that will be attractive to a gallerist.
And what about, so that is one aspect of the institution, is the kind of arts institutions like museums, galleries, but what about educational institutions, which is also another aspect of your work, is the kind of academia. How do you resolve these contradictions in academia?
Yeah, you see, because actually the art schools in the universities have been, you know, very central in sort of producing, of course, the kinds of artists that have sort of flourished. So there was an actual problem, because if you look at the demographics in the art schools, there were, I mean, the imbalances were just glaring, right? So in an art school, as a Black person, you would be a minority, even though you represent a majority. So there would be maybe 1 or 2 Black students in an art class. And I mean, I think in my year, there were only 2 of us. And a lot of people will attest to her being, at least 1 or 2 Black students in studying art at university level. And that problem also comes from basic, it can also be traced back to basic education as well, because given the legacies of apartheid, Black schools generally underfunded, so they can't actually offer art as a subject. And then you have the white schools, or what was termed the Model C schools, which were white schools that accepted Black students, that then would have the art training, but they are better resource. But it also means that it's mostly the students that come from those schools that will be able to qualify to get into university, to even be in. So the racial imbalance was glaring.
It's systemic. It's systemic.
Yeah, it is. And so what you ended up with is that the very art market, and I think in those early years, the late 90s, 2000s, most of the people who had the kind of cultural networks, that enabled them to flourish as artists were mostly white. But I remember there was a documentary, a very interesting documentary that was called "The Luggage Is Still Labeled" by Vuile Voia and is it Karen McGee? I forget her name. I'm so sorry.
Mm-hmm.
But in the documentary, they interviewed, white artists, white writers, Black artists, Black writers, and especially the few who could find themselves in art schools in terms of what they thought. And I mean, there was this notion of somebody said, actually, there's the kind of hypervisibility now of Black artists because everyone is interested in sort of Black narratives and so on. But someone else is actually say that there's something quite problematic about that too, because they are hyper visible as the objects on display rather than as people with agency within the whole industry itself. Who can determine the kind of work that gets done, who can I mean, I think even up until just recently there was only one Black gallerist in South Africa, which was Momo Gallery. Of course, there are a few more now, Black galleries, but it was only until.
But it's interesting. It's interesting that it's a kind of similar problem that exists in the West, because in the West, if you speak to Black artists, they will say, "I am Black. I'm an artist, but I do." But I think those two things kind of stand in their own right. I don't want to be put on a pedestal because I'm a Black artist.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that there is a similar kind of notion even in South Africa is probably the most westernized African country, but.
Yeah. I mean, I think in deeply racist societies, it's very difficult to not be constantly reminded, hey, after all, you're Black. So you might be very successful, but you will be reminded that, a successful Black artist. So I think, I think there was a time when in South Africa there was a popularity of this concept of Afrofuturism, through which I think kind of played on this dialectic of, but one hand trying to kind of understand one's Black identity, reclaim it on the basis of the pasts that we can imagine, but also think of a future that's radically different, so we don't constantly have to be reminded that we're Black, because it is tiring. So one is left with this predicament you know, because on one hand, you want to know that I am an artist who is accepted. I am a writer who's accepted because I'm a good writer, right? Not because I'm one of the few Black writers or I'm one of the few.
I'm a top 10 Black writers in the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You want to know, you know, for your own sense of dignity and just being in the world, you want to know that I function as a human being in the world. And yet at the same time, because you live in a racist society, it becomes really hard to not always be conscious, because you're constantly reminded in terms of the access you will have, the opportunities you will have, the way you'll be treated. You know, so all of those things will remind you that you're Black. So you have to, in some ways, you take it up as a political identity, as a political stance. And I think a lot of artists have kind of done that, you know, in terms of like forming Black artist collectives.
Is that what you do? Is that what you do in your work? Because you're a practicing artist, but you're also a curator and an academic. So you kind of exist on so many levels.
Yeah. So yeah, there's that. And then I do a lot of transformation work in the university as well. You know, so I've been part of the Black Academic Caucus, and I am currently working as Deputy Dean for Transformation. So my work currently is very different because, you know, I'm finding myself having to deal with, you know, employment equity policies, you know, and I mean, nobody trained me to write policy.
It's interesting because this goes back to the beginning of our conversation where you said that within the legislature there is power.
Yeah. But I mean, you know, yeah, there is power in the legislature, and I think, you know, our work really has to go back to being there to shape the kinds of policies that will obviously determine the rules of the game, and so it becomes important work as well, you know, to do that. And then I also started a platform called the Creative Knowledge Resources, which is also just meant to support you know, emerging artists, but also I think to try and generate more scholarship towards doing things differently than traditional art history, to try and go back into trying to produce in a much more socially responsive way. And yeah, and to be given the platform to play, you know, we don't, like, I mean, we are always political, but I think there are people who come, you know, that I've spoken to that say, I just need a break. I want to play with ideas. I want to experiment. I want to explore. I don't want to do anything around my identity, because my identity is not everything that I am, and it doesn't define, you know, it really doesn't limit what I can. I don't want it to limit what I can and can't do. And so I think the thing is to create the spaces to do that, but at the same time, to be there when the policy is being decided. Now, of course, my position doesn't allow me to be able to see myself as someone in power, because it's still very volatile space. Political dynamics are just very intense at UCT. There's always the push and pull, you know. So it's a kind of it's like, you know, the very nature of power, of course, is that it's a volatile thing. You know, you can have the sense that you've got the power, but it can easily be taken away from you. You know, and yeah, so I mean, it's really just understanding those dynamics as well. So I'm kind of in those different spaces, curating, and like all my curatorial work has been collaborative, working with Nkule Mabaso, and then as an artist, and then as an art historian, but I think mostly transformation.
And when it comes to, which is another aspect of what you do, when it comes to talking to the outside world, how do you reset the terms at which you communicate? Because you curated a Venice Biennale pavilion, for example, a few years ago. for South Africa. So, but you've also engaged in universities around the world and fellowships and things like that. So how do you reset the terms of engagement with the outside world?
Yeah, that's a very interesting one. So the Venice Biennale was maybe let me just give you the example of this sort of transition from how you're communicating ideas in South Africa and how you're communicating ideas to the outside world. So for the Venice Biennale, obviously, I think one of the things that probably needs to change about the Venice Biennale is the power that is given to governments. So in South Africa has had the lease of that space in Venice. I think they had a 10-year lease that I think expired, I think a year or two ago, but they set, they send out they put out a call, they then put out the tenders, and so you apply for a tender, which in some ways is very problematic, I think, and I think that's what makes the Venice Biennale something that probably needs to change, is a sort of national reinforcement of like national identities, and because they're so complex as well, right? But because it's like because it is the government, the ideas they wanted had to speak to some of the things that they've been told are goals. So, things like social cohesion.
Yeah, the jargon.
And all of that, all of this rhetoric, making it good, and that they are supporting their artists, and and whereas I think what we wanted to do really was to kind of show, or at least show or demonstrate the contradictions of South African society through visual dialogue between three artists. And the way in which the media communication in South Africa framed it was actually, I mean, we laughed about some of it because it just felt like they completely missing the point, especially when we talk about resilience. We really don't mean that people must withstand all the whatever difficulties. What we mean by resilience is completely different. And so of course, to the outside world, we were actually banking on an understanding that the art market, but also the outside world would have. But I think also the outside, inside, these can be blurry, because so even in South Africa, there are people who we felt could understand where we were going with it, but we felt that government was framing it in a particular way. And so to the general populace, it's presented in a particular way. But I think within the art world, there were people who could see, I think, the nuances and the fact that we are actually wanting to focus on understanding conflict. We're not shying away from it. And we're not talking about social cohesiveness as if conflict and antagonism is not a central part of it. So in commissioning work by Tracy Rose, I guess, one is kind of showing that kind of schizophrenic nature of South African society, where its histories are, the histories are kind of making it seem even more absurd, right? So it really was around the absurdities, the conflict, the antagonism, land, questions around land and land dispossession in the work of Dineo Bupape, anti-institutional stances in the work of Mawande Gazenzile. Mawande is unapologetically against the workings of the institution. So I think they didn't get that, and they wanted to kind of, make it seem as if, no, this is supporting artists and it's about social cohesion, and so. But to the outside world, I think we are dealing in a global space where there are similarities in terms of the kinds of intercultural conflict the kinds of contestations over space, over land. These are things that are there in the art, in the world globally.
Yeah.
You know, all of those things are, we experience, everybody experiences. And so how do we then say this is not something that is just particular? Yes, there are South African particularities, but how do we then draw similarities in terms of the kinds of phenomena that make our human lives so complicated? And so how do we get other people outside to then identify with, you know, with the phenomena rather than with the specificity? So once they identify with the phenomena, they can then begin to engage with the South African specificities. Yeah, so I guess, yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting, but it almost brings us back to the kind of earlier question of how do you then, so you seem to be able to facilitate a dialogue with the outside world far easier than facilitating a dialogue internally.
Yes, actually.
Right?
Yes. I think there are things that I think there are spaces in South Africa that just are probably not very welcoming in terms of, and I think people also get tired of hearing about race and class, and so you're kind of dealing with very vested interests. Right. So, and because you're dealing with vested interests, it makes it even more complicated to have those dialogues internally. And much easier, you know, for someone who's like, well, you know, I'm genuinely interested to understand what's happening in South Africa. You know, for me, it's not like, you know, where someone, you know, if someone talks about whiteness, it's in South Africa, it's as if you are targeting them particularly. You know? So I think, yeah, I think also based on the kinds of interests.
So just one final, and I'll let you go, and I thank you so much for your time, but I do have one final kind of connection to make. So we've made a connection, internal South African connection. We've made an external South African connection to the West, but South Africa, African connection. So talking to other countries and other cultural territories within Africa, how is that conversation being facilitated? And is there perhaps the place where this kind of exploration and experimentation that you're talking about could be a kind of really engaged, multi-layered dialogue?
Yeah. So I mean, I think that is complicated by South Africa's xenophobic violence that started happening since 2008 and has been happening periodically ever since. And I think the general perception that it's putting out that South Africans are generally arrogant and they are Afrophobic, you know, so it's not necessarily a xenophobia because there's no hostility towards white foreigners, but
how interesting is that?
African foreigners. And so because of that perception, it's I guess it kind of makes it uneasy. But I mean, there have been connections and networks that have been established way before between scholars here and in Africa and the rest of Africa. Of course, we always laugh at ourselves because people talk about South Africa as if it's not in Africa. You know, so for the rest of the continent, I think there always have been those connections. There have been projects, you know, that have involved South African artists. For example, the Raw Material Company in Dakar, and you know, where people used to attend the condition report sessions. Then when BC was still alive, when she used to run the ASICO school, she involved scholars like Nondobe Gondombela, you know, and people came from different parts of the African continent. So I think there's definitely still like a need and a genuine interest in transnational Pan-African solidarity amongst artists. Moreover, I think recently the South African art market has opened up to other African artists. So for example, one of the major art competitions, the ABSA, it used to be opened to just South African artists. Now it's opened to any practicing artist within the continent. A lot of the galleries have also started opening themselves up to representing artists from the rest of the continent. So I think the only thing that stains it is really the xenophobic violence that has happened, but it also has to be understood historically, because much of that violence actually happens in Black townships. So in universities and the art world, it's something that might be discussed and might be engaged by artists, but it's not, I don't think, it's not necessarily something that artists themselves would advocate for. I don't think they would necessarily be, Afrophobic. And I think that the reason the Afrophobic violence is happening in Black townships is because of the inequalities that people are facing in that space. And so, of course, with scarce resources, and really just generally a government that just doesn't, provide the services it should be providing, and then where it seems as if, when Africans from other African countries come and live in townships, that they're able to start up business, they are entrepreneurial. So it seems as if they are taking up the opportunities that, where in areas where they are scarce. But I think generally in the rest of, for those who are educated, there's no particular dislike or hate. And in fact, I think there's growing need for more Pan-African dialogues, in terms of the scholars that are invited and artists that are invited to collaborate. But yeah, of course, it's very difficult to get around.
I mean, I guess it's also because all these post-colonial conditions are so different, right? So everyone's relationship to their identity or kind of reclaiming of the identity is kind of slightly different.
No, absolutely. But they remain important. I mean, I think, and there are quite a few projects that are focused on, making sure that, at least enabling the collaboration between artists from different African countries. The Institute for Creative Arts, that's run by Jay as well. I mean, they launched LANA, which was the Live Art Network in Africa, or Live Art Network of Africa. So, and again, it brought together, artists in live arts or at least to practice live arts from the rest of the continent, instead of understanding the more common challenges that we face on the continent.